Hi, I was just wondering if, although you guys all put different arguments for and against cap and trade versus a carbon tax, would it be possible or a bad idea to try to implement both? Would it speed up the process to lowering our emissions, or would it just create a complicated process that wouldn't really get much done?
Don't do it. Too confusing, and when you, their rival policy, yeah, their rival policies, it's too confusing.
I think you need to turn the switch on.
No.
Dr. Ackerman, would you turn your mic on, please?
Does this work? Okay. Don't do it. They're rival policies. There's some inconsistencies with them. It would create massive confusion. We have already seen that the American public is getting extremely skeptical of 1,000-page bills. So when you add complexity in a big public policy, what you do is you add the possibility that people will find all sorts of evil intentions in it. It undermines the policy. Keep it simple.
By the way, the last plenary panel this afternoon is going to go into more detail on that kind of issue. Next question, please.
Yeah, this is kind of a, hello? This is kind of a housekeeping question. Mr. Ackerman had the title of his book on the thing. I'm just wondering, for those of us who are not efficient note takers, you could tell us where on the internet or in bookstores the other two panelists could, we could find their kind of a good summation of their remarks.
We are going to be posting all these, the PowerPoint presentations and texts as they're available to us on the pricing carbon website.
Google any of our names, I'm sure it's the fastest way to find it.
I also provided references in the last slide, but
Questions?
Hi. We posed this idea in a discussion with Representative Markey of Massachusetts, and perhaps Jim Hansen could comment on this later. He said that the cap and dividend idea is a good one, but you'd have to give different amounts of money to people in different states because of the differing carbon intensity. So how do you answer that question?
You know, I'm wondering if, can we take, will you be here this afternoon? Can we take, that's a very important question. The afternoon plenary, the last one, is really devoted to that kind of issue, if I could. Next, right here.
I'm just curious if even from the president we're getting words like chunks, sectors. Is there any is there room to commit to a sectoral approach, and if so, where do we start?
Well, most U.S. carbon emissions come from electricity and transportation. I mean, depending on what you mean by the sector. I mean, if you could decarbonize electricity and transportation, it would be most of the way there. That's not to say that I have any specific hopes for why that's going to be possible in today's political environment.
Gary?
I think Dan's going to talk a lot about this, but if the EPA moves forward in the absence of pricing carbon, it's not going to be able to do the whole economy all at once, and it will think about sectors and chunks.
Next question.
Professor Carmack, how do we keep the argument for reducing our dependence on foreign oil, which you referred to, from giving ammunition to the people who want to drill in Alaska and the Gulf and other endangered places, and the shale in Canada?
That's always been the problem with this argument. It has always been the problem of creating a left of center coalition around that argument. I think that you have to separate the issues, fight them separately, and try to get some piece of the Republican Party back into the environmental movement. If I would have shown one slide today, I would have shown you a slide of public opinion from 1998 to the present. And the depressing thing about that slide is that in 1988 and 1999, the people believing that we needed to do something about climate change, there were an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. Beginning in about 2000, those two lines diverged. And now we have a party that is, one party that is devoted to climate change, the Democrats, and we have one party in which most of the climate change deniers fall, the Republicans. We can't achieve big public policy changes with a partisan difference like that. We have to get some piece of the Republican Party to be on the climate change page. And probably national security is one way to open that conversation with them and then have to deal with the other issues as they come up.
By the way, Representative Inglis and Bill Shireman have a panel, I think in the, right after Dr. Hansen's talk, devoted to that very subject. Next question. I want to really keep the
Yeah,
question.
okay, that's fine. We're having a problem with the mic on that side. It's being replaced, and then we'll do a number of questions on that side, but a question right here.
Hi, Ezra Hausman, Synapse Energy Economics, and more importantly, Wesleyan Class of '85. So I'm very much in favor of pricing carbon, of course, as we all are, but I don't have as much faith as you folks seem to of the private sector of solving the problems we have in front of us. It's going to take massive public investment in infrastructure to get to the kinds of carbon emissions reductions that are necessary, including completely replacing our transportation infrastructure. Okay, I promised it wasn't a speech.
Yeah.
So my question for you is, what part of the money, I understand you say give it all back, how much of the money should go to changing infrastructure, direct investments in renewable energy, changing housing and buildings in this country, and how much should go back? I'd like you to comment on what you think the appropriate division is.
And so the overflow rooms have asked me to summarize the questions. How much of the revenues from pricing carbon should be allocated to federal investment in infrastructure improvement and other direct investments that will improve energy efficiency? So, Gary?
Yeah, real quickly, it strikes me give it back is really important, but if you're worried about the equity part, you don't have to give it back to everybody, and that would relieve some of the funding for a variety of other initiatives. The limiting panel said price carbon, but if you notice that essentially the take-home message was pricing carbon was necessary, but by no means sufficient. And there are a variety of other initiatives that they envision using at least some of the money for. And 30 seconds on the national security question, there's another way of getting national security issue to the fore that doesn't involve petroleum, involves the military's view of climate as a risk enhancer and the idea that they're thinking seriously about how they wander around the world and respond to a variety of humanitarian disasters that may involve migration over borders where people don't like each other. They do, as Congressman Larson said yesterday, a lot of wargaming on this sort of thing, and they are the best people in Washington in dealing with what goes on in the dark tales of the distribution. Get them to talk more and more about it, and they will engage in that conversation.
Just specifically on the numerical question, the study in which we estimated $75 a ton was the price was needed. We also looked at the equity implications of how much you give back. If you want to have the median household in every state come out ahead from equal per capita refunds, you have to give 85% of it back. If you're willing to only have 47 states come out okay because Alaska, North Dakota, and Wyoming are impossibly carbon intensive, the other 99.4% of us who don't live in those states, you could have a lower percentage.
Next question. How about all the way in the back, please? Thank you.
Yes, on the relation between addressing climate and the economy, it seems to me that with a dividend policy of returning money to the American people, that you're really doing both. When you put a price on carbon and you return most of the money or all of the money to the American people, you're putting money in people's pocketbooks, particularly low-income people, working-class people. They need that money. They're going to spend it. That's going to be good for the economy, create jobs. Could you comment on that?
Well, that's one of the things we're going to have a panel on this afternoon, but one of the reasons that some of us believe we should give it back So you can give it back in a variety of ways, right? You can dividend it back, you can give it back by cuts in payroll taxes or by cuts in income taxes. Some of us favor cuts in payroll taxes. Payroll taxes are the most regressive tax in the American tax system because it hits working wage people hardest, and over $106,000 a year, guess what? You stop paying your payroll taxes. So wealthy people really get a break on payroll taxes. A carbon tax would hit help wealthy people more because they use more carbon. They're the ones who have more than one car, big houses, boats, sometimes airplanes, etc. And the give back would be proportionally more valuable to working class people. So from a purely progressive point of view, and we're going to talk about this more later, from a purely progressive point of view, the mechanism of the give back matters, and that's why we favor, my organization favors a payroll tax.
Next question. That's right, you, in the red shirt.
Works. So we all know in the next 2 years with Republican control of the House, there's not going to be anything passed in the U.S. Congress. Do you think it would be more viable of a strategy in the short term to focus on a state-by-state basis, such as focusing on pushing through more policy in big states like California, where the Democrats still have control?
So the question, given the tough outlook in Congress for at least the next 2 years, should the focus of legislative action be on the states such as California? Gary?
Sure, I think that's true. One of the good news results from the election was that AB 32 survived repeal.
In California?
In California. That was their climate change legislation. But as Dan has pointed out, the elections weren't just for the House and the Senate, they were for state houses and state legislatures, and a lot of states around the country, switch parties means less support for climate legislation even at the state level. But nonetheless, Reggie is still up and running, and AB 32 is going to be applied, so whatever we can get is in the interim is a good idea.
Next question.
In discussing the politics of the moment, nobody has mentioned the deficit and the deficit hawks yet. And my question is, do you see any way that collection of interest could be turned to addressing the climate problem?
I mean, I think it's important to understand that people who are trying to cut the deficit as a solution to unemployment are as wrong as the climate skeptics. Cutting the deficit will actually worsen unemployment. This is perfectly clear basic economics. You could talk about what the long-run deficit should be at some future time when we have returned to something closer to full employment. That's a valuable question, but postponing deficit reduction would be the right policy for now.
Barry, I just want to do a time check with you. Are we okay for a few more questions? It's your call.
What is the time? It's 2 minutes and 10. 2 to 10.
Okay, so 5 more minutes. A few more questions.
Up there.
Sorry, thank you.
Hi. Thanks for taking my question. Arguably, along with the climate issues, the tax system in our country is completely broken, and there's a larger consensus about that. When I look at some basic math, we use about 300 billion gallons of petroleum a year in the country, and our current federal revenue total is 2.165 trillion. So if you do the math, that ends up being $7.24 a gallon. And if you add in the value of the actual petroleum, including all the current taxes on it, it comes to $9.84 a gallon total.
Okay, can you state your question?
My question is, and just one more thing, if you add taxes on coal and on natural gas, we'd be less than Europeans are paying for energy currently. What would folks here think about replacing 100% of all federal revenue with with a tax on energy like that, and
Okay,
just
let's-
wiping out the IRS.
Okay, let's
Every
have
other
one answer to that.
Not much.
It's hard to envision. It seems like, destabilize the government. Government has gotten a strangely bad name. It actually does a lot of things that you need that you wouldn't be happy if it stopped doing. Even the people who are protesting it the most. And I think, incremental changes in that direction sound good. It's very hard to envision that kind of 100% change.
Okay, next question.
Can I just say one thing to that, though? I do think there is something interesting in the questioner's comment. I think that a carbon tax, there will be a big debate about our tax system in the next couple of years. It's long overdue for reform. And I think a really important point is to get some kind of carbon tax in discussions about tax reform. In other words, that's a part of broadening the discussion of climate change beyond environmentalism. So you want to broaden it to a national security discussion. You also want to broaden it to a discussion about tax reform. And I think that that could be incredibly useful as a piece of a tax reform discussion.
Thank you. Next.
Charlie, here's our last question.
Hi, this is a question about your idea of broadening discussion and reaching across the table to Republicans and people who have different opinions that can be reached with different arguments. Now, this is something I've been thinking about myself. I think it's quite valuable. The question that I've been stuck on at the moment is, where is this happening? What are the groups that have gotten the most traction already beginning to do this so that I may join them?
I think that you saw Congressman Larson last night, okay? He has been actually very valuable in this discussion. Interestingly enough, there's a couple Republican United States senators who I think could be brought into this discussion, Susan Collins, Jim Cooper. There are pieces, but one of the things I think before all of us who work on this topic in Washington is to kind of investigate this new Republican coalition and see, in fact, where there might be points of discussion with them. And that's why this conference, that's why I congratulated James for having great timing at this conference. This is exactly the time to think about the new political landscape.
If I could add one name to that list, Dick Lugar, it's on foreign relations. He is also sensitive to the education process about climate change. I'm not so sure he doesn't see climate as a good way to sell corn or something, but he understands that there are climate risks and that climate is a risk enhancer for the national security. Some of us have had conversations with his staff about the next Congress and bringing people together to have conversations not to defend their stance on climate policy and for people who think it's a stupid idea, they have to defend it or whatever, but rather do something that Rob Lambert has done with a lot of his clients out at RAND, get them to sit in a room for a half a day or a day and try to figure out what the world would have to look like and how it would have to operate for their position on climate policy to be the right one. And so they're not defending their climate policy, they're exploring the underlying assumptions that makes that the appropriate question. And that's coming from a Republican senator with actually some clout. He did actually show up with Secretary Clinton for the arms reduction. So he's out there a little bit.
Okay, wasn't this a terrific panel?